On July 17th of 2024, the International Monetary Fund released a report stating that Canada would be the fastest growing economy in the G7 in 2025. And soon after, every business magazine, publication, and even the current ruling party of Canada itself parroted this notion about how Canada is doing great with its economy. And well, this became a little bit bothersome to me because if a person were to just look at these headlines, they would walk away thinking that Canada is in amazing shape with its economy. But yet, just taking an extra 2 seconds looking at the actual metrics would tell you that not only is Canada's economy doing horribly, but it's technically in a recession. And this brings me to a topic that I care about a lot, and that is how powerful people, governments, and numbers themselves can lie. And that what Canada is doing right now is one of the last signs of an economy before it collapses. You see, throughout history there have been plenty of examples of countries lying about their numbers, but I want to focus on one that is quite comparable to Canada's current situation. You know, if you were to wind the clock back to the 1920s or the 1930s, we would enter an economic era in the United States called the Great Depression. I'm sure many of you know about it. However, during this time, there were quite a lot of political leaders and powerful people that pretty much refused to acknowledge that there was an economic situation that was the worst in the country's history. And one of these people was Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover, before becoming the poster child for economic disasters, was a globe-trotting mining engineer and an accidental philanthropist. He struck it rich before 40, digging up shiny rocks and turning them into shiny dollars. During World War I, he miraculously organized global food relief, feeding millions and earning the title the Great Humanitarian, a nickname that became hilariously iconic when he later couldn't feed America's unemployed people during the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression, if you don't know, was a time when the American dream took a nosedive and crash-landed into a nightmare. The 1929 stock market crash left millions without any wealth or savings, but there stood Herbert Hoover, the nation's ever-optimistic cheerleader-in-chief. If only clapping harder could have brought the economy back, Hoover's applause would have been thunderous enough to wake up the dead. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the 1929 crash, Hoover played the role of motivational speaker, where he had an unshakable belief in America's economic resilience. The fundamental business of the country is on a sound and prosperous basis, he declared in December of 1929, presumably while ignoring the millions watching their life savings evaporate. It's almost as if Hoover believed that repeating the mantra enough times would magically transform despair into prosperity. As unemployment rates skyrocketed, Hoover's administration displayed a level of denial typically reserved for reality TV show contestants. By 1930, it was clear the economic downturn was not just a minor hiccup, yet Hoover remained steadfast in his rosy projections. He assured the public that the worst was over, just as the unemployment rate soared towards an unprecedented 25%. It's as if he thought the power of positive thinking could fill empty stomachs and reopen shuttered factories. Hoover eventually rolled out some public works programs like the construction of the Hoover Dam, which of course he had to name after himself. Now sure, it provided jobs, but it was a drop in the bucket compared to the ocean of unemployment. Hoover touted these projects as grand solutions, as if a single dam could hold back the flood of economic despair. Meanwhile, bread lines stretched longer than the construction sites and shantytowns dubbed Hoovervilles in his dubious honor sprouted across the nation. In 1932, Hoover introduced the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, also known as the RFC, which funneled money to banks and big businesses in hopes of jump-starting the economy. Now, of course, this trickle-down approach worked about as well as giving a parched man a bottle of water with a pinhole. The RFC's funds mostly lined the pockets of wealthy executives, while the average American continued to scrape by, wondering when they'd see any of that promised prosperity. Hoover's steadfast commitment to minimal government intervention was almost admirable in its obliviousness to the reality of America's situation. He clung to the belief that the American economy would self-correct despite all evidence to the contrary. His statements and policies reflected a stubborn optimism as he repeatedly assured that the public, that recovery was just around the corner. This ideological rigidity meant that any meaningful response to the crisis was consistently delayed or diluted. By 1932, the public's patience was thinner than Hoover's grasp on the economy. Now enter the bonus army. Tens of thousands of World War I veterans who marched on Washington, D.C., demanding early payment of their service bonuses. These were desperate men, many of whom were destitute and unemployed. Hoover, ever the compassionate leader, labeled them as radicals and troublemakers. In a move that surely must have looked fantastic in his imagination, Hoover ordered the US Army to clear out the veterans' encampments. Tanks and tear gas were deployed against the very men who had once fought for the country. The resulting scenes of violence and chaos broadcasted across the nation turned public opinion even further against Hoover. Nothing says, "We've got this under control," like attacking impoverished veterans with military force. Despite the mounting evidence that things were indeed not getting better, Hoover clung to his delusional optimism with the tenacity of a dog with a bone. He continued to assure the American public that recovery was just around the corner. This corner, however, seemed to be located in the same place where the Toronto Maple Leaf Stanley Cup dreams are also located. It probably does not exist. He repeatedly emphasized the few positive indicators he could find, conveniently ignoring the overwhelming negative ones. For instance, he pointed to occasional upticks in stock prices or minor improvements in certain industries as signs that the tide was turning. Meanwhile, the overall economy continued to spiral downward, with banks failing and businesses closing at an alarming rate. As the 1932 presidential election approached, Hoover's credibility was in tatters. Franklin D. Roosevelt, with the promise of a New Deal and a proactive approach to the economic crisis, was a beacon of hope to a nation weary of Hoover's platitudes and inaction. Hoover's campaign tried to paint Roosevelt's plans as radical and dangerous, but yet much of the public supported Roosevelt. Now, the election results were a landslide, with Roosevelt winning 42 of the 48 states. Hoover's defeat was so resounding that it became one of the worst defeats in the history of the presidential election. The public had clearly had enough of his ineffective leadership and empty reassurances. Hoover left office with a legacy defined by his unwavering and often unfounded optimism. His statements and policies during the Great Depression consistently downplayed the severity of the crisis and failed to provide the necessary intervention to mitigate the suffering of millions. His ideological rigidity and refusal to acknowledge the depth of the economic problems contributed to the prolonged misery of the American people. In the end, Hoover's administration is a stark reminder of the dangers of denying reality in the face of overwhelming evidence. His attempts to sugarcoat the economic situation did little to alleviate the suffering and only served to erode public trust in his government. The Great Depression required bold, decisive action, but Hoover's tenure was marked by a stubborn adherence to ineffective policies and a refusal to fully confront the magnitude of the crisis. Now, what ended up getting the United States out of the Great Depression was a combination of things. Sweeping public reforms from Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal saw some of the largest government interventions in the economy ever. The natural end to the boom-bust cycle also played a role, meaning that American perseverance ironically did end up helping end the Great Depression. And lastly, the kickoff of World War II led to America ramping up its military production, employment by drafting, women in the workforce, and massive government spending. All of this led to America finally being pulled out of the Great Depression and moved into a wartime economy. And so, what is the moral here? Well, it's that lying about the state of an economy and putting in policies that only help the rich and not the middle class of a country, well, those tend to be disastrous and extend the bad economic times by years or even decades. I mean, there are plenty of other examples where these things have led to disasters, like in the post-war Soviet Union, Greece in 2008, Argentina in 2007, and more. And now it seems like we can add one more example to that list, and that is Canada. Remember how the ruling Liberal Party and a ton of papers and publications were touting how great Canada's economic growth outlook is? This year, Canada's economy is projected to grow at a rate of just 1.3%, and next year, 2.4%. However, Canada is going through a population explosion right now by bringing in millions of residents per year. In fact, solely from immigration, Canada's population increased by 3.2% in 2023. It has only been ramping up, meaning that Canada's real GDP per capita has actually been shrinking drastically over the last few years, and on a per capita basis, Canada will not only be not prosperous in 2025, but it will technically be in a recession. The only reason why publications are touting Canada's economy as growing and being successful next year is because of immigration. Meanwhile, the average Canadian will actually be poorer by this time next year. But this is the Canadian government we're talking about. One that really truly cares about its people and not one that gives gifts to the oligarchs and corporations that fund its campaigns. You see, there was an old law in Canada that stated that when unemployment was 6% or higher, there would be an immediate halt to all temporary foreign workers in low-wage industries. Essentially, this law was in place to give unemployed Canadians a chance to find work and then increase wages across the country. But right when that law was needed in 2022, when unemployment was over 6%, it was scrapped, allowing for uncapped temporary foreign workers to enter the Canadian workforce. This law was put back in place after 2 years in having millions of foreign workers enter the Canadian workforce. So essentially, the Canadian government gave a gift to the giant corporations wanting to suppress wages and wanting Canada's GDP growth to look better than it really was, even if it was at the expense of average everyday Canadians. And so that brings up the question, who is giving this directive to the Canadian government? Well, here's who. This year, the Canadian government launched a massive consultation survey on immigration levels in Canada, and the survey came back saying these immigration levels were good for Canada. Here's a direct quote from the immigration consultation for the Government of Canada. Immigration levels. Most stakeholders continue to believe that levels targets are about right or should increase. And so, who are these people that were the consultants for this survey? Well, there were 4,700 stakeholders invited, and participating stakeholders included, but were not limited to, nonprofit organizations, settlement or resettlement organizations, academic and educational institutions, government bodies, employers and businesses, chambers of commerce, Francophone and official language minority community organizations, and industry and sector councils. Essentially, every single one of these benefit from high immigration levels and cheap labor. In fact, only 0.8% of the stakeholders invited were unions or worker advocacy groups. Just some perspective, in comparison to the amount of worker advocacy and union groups invited to this consultation, there were twice as many tourist businesses invited, 7 times as many language training businesses and organizations invited, and 27 times as many settlement and resettlement organizations invited. So that's who's consulting on Canada's immigration right now, the people that benefit from it. Publications lie, governments lie, and sometimes even numbers lie. And another example that I saw recently was this article about the country of Turkey. Wealth in Turkey grew the most in the world at 157% despite soaring inflation, according to Ranking. Now, many people would just read this headline and think that Turkey is going through an economic boom. Pop the champagne and have some kebabs because Turkey's economy is the greatest in the world. However, if you were to go into the details a bit, you would find that a large reason why wealth has increased an insane amount is because inflation is sitting at around 71%, and the Turkish lira has depreciated by nearly 83% against the dollar over the last 5 years, meaning that the currency itself is becoming worthless, and so the price of all assets are going up. In fact, almost the entirety of Turkey's wealth gain has gone to homeowners who have seen housing prices skyrocket. So, in a sense, this wealth creation of Turkey is entirely fake. And the wealth that has been gained by some is going to people that already have wealth. And just to show you, let's have a look at how the middle class is doing in Turkey. It should be amazing, right? That's what every article is saying. But according to the CEIC, the average household income in Turkey has fallen from $4,134 in 2013 to $2,208 in 2023, meaning that the average household in Turkey has actually been losing ground over the past decade or so. And then there's all the articles about unemployment hitting record lows, hiding the fact that unemployment in Turkey is still sitting at around 10%, which is ridiculously high. But you know how I was able to tell all these articles were lying about Turkey's prosperity? It was actually all of the complaints about how kebabs were becoming luxury items and too expensive for the average Turkish person. But you know what? Maybe one day in the far future, when a utopian society develops, maybe we will have governments all around the world that don't lie to our faces and actually care about the average everyday people. But until then, we can keep living in this fake world where we're told everything is just amazing. So let's have some fun with it. And if you want to have some more fun, make sure to click on my documentaries playlist. I have a ton of other videos on there, just like this. And for now, that is all. I will see you guys in my next video when you click on my playlist in just a few seconds.